milestones that you need to meet. There are elements under the method that outline, what a forest and what a woodland is and looks like, and the milestones that you might need to meet before you can get the certificate for that particular method. There are future priority methods also in consideration at the moment. As we understand, the government has identified publicly some priority methods that will follow through, a First Nations-led method, and they're working and engaging with a range of organisations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, around what that looks like. Protection method is one that we have been pursuing. If a market is genuine about delivering on the Global Biodiversity Framework and the national targets that have been set under achieving a 30% protection of lands and waters by 2030, then we need to have methods there that will drive that investment. There's also, we've talked about forest and woodland, there's also a rangelands method that has been identified as a priority, and there's also a feral pest method that's been identified as a priority as well. We know that the impacts of invasive species, of pest species, are widespread and having a major impact on biodiversity across Australia. So there's some of the methods that are prioritised and ones that will enable us to meet the objective of the market to deliver on global biodiversity frameworks.
Had an interesting conversation with somebody in a similar position to you, Jodie, and they talked about what it is to recruit landholders into projects like this. Not an easy job. Participation of landholders. Participation of landholders,
and what we hear continuously is that there is confusion by landholders. There are a lot of options on the table for a landholder to give consideration to. They're thinking about, is a carbon market right for me? What's this emerging nature market? How is all of those things going to impact on my future land use, my productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So, while Guy talks and reflects on the barriers that he hears from, the private sector, our sector's engaging daily with landholders across the country. Different challenges, but barriers as well. And I think some of the ways to, we need to be driving participation in order to stand a market up. And that means giving people the right information. It means effective, reliable and trustful outreach. We need to think about how, going to the scale point, how do we enable a landholder to both access the knowledge, information, the decision-making tools, as well as actually then undertake and apply a method. It costs a lot to measure a baseline. What is the baseline of my property right now? If I restore this particular forest community, how do I know that that's restored to the required level by the required time frame? It requires measurement. It then requires third-party verification. So an individual landholder being able to undertake that kind of activity is prohibitive. So the idea of aggregation, the idea of collective effort and the cross-collaboration is going to be really important. There's been a lot of talk about investing in capacity and capability of the private sector to understand nature. Equally, we need to be investing in capacity and capability building of the supply side to ensure that both landholders can participate, but also that we're innovating around how do we actually deliver these methods that are going to be prioritised? How do we scale them up, in the ways that Guy has talked to? And how do we get that cross-cultural collaboration? I mean, if you talk about cross-culture, there's also in the rainforest method, there's the opportunity to identify cultural species. Now, that isn't going to be done by a non-Aboriginal person, but there are frameworks, recommendations and pathways that as a landholder you can take, or a participant that you can take, to engage with the First Nations communities for that particular method. So it's not just that it should be a consideration only for a First Nations method, but built into all of the methods as well.
You've explained, I think, the level of work involved in standing up these projects. And I have to say, when you look at the price settings of a voluntary market, you do wonder whether or not, the biodiversity credit is going to be enough to attract the level of funding and finance that is needed in order to actually mature in this space. Are there further thoughts from the panel just with regard to price signals in the nature repair market?
Maybe just a quick one. We do dance on this topic between nature markets and biodiversity credit mechanisms relatively often, and recognising a point that you made at the outset, Amanda, that we talk about nature. recognising and respecting the full range of values that protecting and restoring nature brings, and biodiversity and credits, to the point that was made, is one financial mechanism in a suite. So this market should be able to the point around providing choice, we should be able to present and provide a range of different financial mechanisms that also recognise a range of different values within nature, whether it's water, whether it's obviously strong cultural components. Biodiversity and carbon are all part of that. Biodiversity credits are a very small drop in the ocean at the moment. Actually, Australia plays a significant role in terms of global sales or transactions in biodiversity credit type units. There's a couple of developers and project developers here that have really, had a big impact in a very, very small market. So that's really interesting. But then, and that's obviously presented as being against the gap, the 700 billion plus that's needed. It's not even a drop. It's like it's a little speck or piece of dust. And that's one thing. But we also, when we do look at the price that's needed, once again, and it's not for me to talk on, but the role of government in setting that price is important, but still making sure that there's not a disconnect between what the market's willing to pay, understanding the types of investments and projects that private sector want to pay, and what government's putting into that market. So this conversation around the nature repair market needs to make sure that that's aligning with the types of projects in the types of landscapes, with the types of values that the investors and businesses are going to be interested in. And I don't have the answer to that. And maybe Jody and Rada, who are both part of the Nature Finance Council, might see whether that discourse is happening. But that's a really interesting piece of setting a proper price, I think.
I don't know. Well, I'm staring at Josh, my economist here, but the question is like, well, what's the willingness to pay, right? Like, I mean, that's ultimately what the question boils down to. And, when I was referring to the U.S. wetland mitigation banking market, well, that price varies, all around. This is not like one uniform market, right? You've got different states and different development pressures, and you've got different marginal costs of, buying a piece of land and then converting it into a functioning ecosystem. And what someone's willing to pay for that is really based upon the scarcity of that ecosystem, how many other, providers there are in the market. It acts like any other kind of market, because you've actually got something to unitize and to sell. But if we're thinking about a company that has made a nature positive commitment and they want to start integrating nature into the products that they're selling, or it's quite separate from this kind of regulated environment, I mean, that's just going to be price discovery, right? I mean, there's going to be wild variations in what people want to do and how they think it impacts the value of what they're trying to do in terms of the landscape or their employees or for the product. But ultimately, what I think the real price discovery is going to be is this notion of integrating the value of nature into all parts of our economy and products and services. The example, the kind of thought exercise I like to have is, okay, well, if we want to move to an economy where there's more regenerative agriculture, or a landscape where there's more regenerative agriculture, you'd want to be building an economic relationship between ultimately, and you can define regenerative agriculture in a lot of ways, but ultimately, what's the value of a more resilient agricultural supply chain in terms of reduction of risk or enhancement of stability of long-term cash flows, because you have better soils or better water retention or cover crops or, more biodiversity in the landscape. And then what does that mean for financing that you can receive as a farmer, because you've actually invested in nature rather than in, you invested in nature as a capital asset in your landscape. And those are we haven't gotten there yet in terms of actually those data sets and that information as to building the relationship between nature and risk and return. But that's ultimately where we need to move to actually get the kind of willingness or true willingness to pay.
Yeah, no, very good points, Rada. And what you're saying also surfaces this idea that a sectoral value chain approach is going to be important in terms of how we actually apply some of these kind of valuation or pricing models into things like agriculture, for example. So I know I'm a Ken Henry self-confessed fan. Anyway, he has notion of nature positive land accus, and it's an interesting idea. But I do wonder to what extent it's possible without taking some kind of systemic look at the agricultural industry, and then all of the other barriers that there are to actually recognizing the importance of regenerative farming practices in that sector.
A few things, I guess, that come to my mind in response to that question. I think we are seeing finance institutions give serious consideration to the risk in the agricultural space. They are thinking about and implementing different, debt arrangements, loan arrangements to support landholders from transitioning from one particular land use to another. So we're seeing some of those value chain elements play out. Nature positive accus, I think is a great idea. We've been recommending for some time that when we talk about the carbon market, it all comes back to design, the design of a market in terms of what you're going to get out the other side. The carbon market is designed for lowest cost abatement. So therefore you are going to get the lowest cost inputs being delivered to achieve that carbon outcome. There is an opportunity now that market is mature enough that the government can procure, because it's currently procuring through the market and it's currently procuring the lowest cost abatement, it could procure for a public good. There is enough other buyers in the market now that a major policy change that could shift the way carbon is actually driving outcomes for nature by having government's procurement of that market in the public good. That would require a policy shift, but again, it all goes to the design of the market, and that might in some way answer your question.
I could maybe give also an example from the real world around, how we might think about this, how this works. So California has one of the largest cap and trade greenhouse gas emissions trading systems in the world. I think it's like the third or fourth largest, second largest maybe, but it also has been in play for over 10 years. And they have it's a classic emissions trading system. There's a cap, it declines over time. They trade pollution permits, but emitters who are regulated can use up to 4% of their emissions cap can be met by offsets. And again, forests in the United States, across, not just in California, but across the continental US and Alaska, have provided the bulk of the offsets, something like 85–88% of offsets into that market, improved forest management and a variety of other kind of projects. So about 5 years ago, California instituted another rule that said, okay, if you buy any offsets to meet your emissions obligation, half of those offsets have to have benefits to California. And this was because of an environmental justice concern, that they wanted more of that economic benefit to come to California. As soon as that rule was put into place and became active, overnight there was a 35% increase in the price of offset credits out of projects in California. So let's think about that, what that could mean in a nature positive ACU sense. What if you say, okay, well, safeguard emitters, X% of what you buy has to come from these approved methods, either from the nature repair market or from biodiverse plantings. You'd suddenly increase the price for those. You'd create scarcity in the market and you'd increase the price. So there's some really simple but elegant policy designs that we can think about to get the public good outcomes that we want.
These are great points, really great points, Radha. I'm glad that you raised the international perspective, and just like to continue in that vein. What do development services mean for Australia here? Clearly it's a shifting global context. Are there opportunities? Is there a role for Australia?
Yeah, maybe I say that sometimes I'm a minted Australian, I'm a naturalized Australian, I'm American, you can hear from the accent. but maybe because of my can-do American attitude, but I always feel that, have always felt that since I've lived in this country, that there's no reason Australia should not be the global leader in the clean energy transition and the sustainable land use transition. This is a country that has extraordinary wealth, a huge capital market, incredible knowledge, both contemporary knowledge and indigenous knowledge, resources, globally relevant and connected supply chains. The list could go on, and is smack dab in the middle of, has incredible solar resources, wind resources, a mega biodiverse continent. Everything is here. And then from an investment perspective, Australia has incredibly low sovereign risk, and has and up until the early 2000s was a global leader in environmental markets. And we've had some political headwinds, but that being said, there's a couple of companies, here, and I'm not getting on getting on any sides of integrity discussions on the carbon markets or whatever. But the point being is that international capital has come in and invested in companies here across carbon, forestry, agriculture, all integrated with carbon markets for billions of dollars. And they're doing it because they like the sovereign environment, they like the regulated environment, and they can see where the value trajectory is of Australia. So that's a huge competitive advantage that Australia needs to build on. And so it's very important that we keep moving in this road, because if the strong regulatory environment, political environment continues, it will attract political capital. It will attract capital, even if people are a little bit nervous. I think internationally remains to be seen. I do think we're in a time where companies, I don't know, Jody and Guy may have other views, but I do think we have to acknowledge that companies now who have previously made commitments are feeling very comfortable walking away from them. And so the pressure has to be, we have to remain putting pressure on companies to say, you can't just walk away, from that. And I don't know how we do that, but we've got to keep our eye on the ball and not be complacent that just because they said they were going to do it, they're going to keep doing it. Because we are in a very strange normative situation at the moment.
Well put. So this is my my last question to the panel. So we'll be opening to questions from the floor after this. So please do prepare. You've talked about a shifting norm environment, and of course we have a federal election around the corner. Hasn't been announced yet. But how do we, given that political context, and this is a question to anyone on the panel who'd like to take it, or you could all answer, but how do we actually, make nature positive, nature investments more of a mainstream matter for voters? Environmental reform has been shelved in the country now. Arguably, that's going to take a whole lot longer than it was intended to from the outset. But how do we make this a bipartisan matter? How do we actually mainstream the need for further investment in our natural environment?
I think if that was an easy answer, we'd be probably not be in this room having this conversation. But I think there is legacy on both sides of the government for investing in the environment. Both sides of government have developed and delivered different, varying environmental policy that has driven, both policy and funding and finance opportunities to protect and restore nature. It's probably fair to say in the context we're in at the moment and where biodiversity loss in Australia is, being a global leader in biodiversity loss, that neither side has won that yet. We know that polling across the public tells us that people care about nature. We know that. We know that polling tells us that people expect that the government is looking after nature and keeping it safe. We know that polling tells us that people expect and want from our government more protection and more funding. However, it is not necessarily at this state of the world that we're operating in, translating into strong election platforms or voting because of where we are as a society. The cost of living is a major issue. You know, global politics are a major challenge for it to become a major election winner. Now that's a challenge. That makes it hard for nature to get a platform for more funding, finance, or mainstream policy. However, we do know that there is a strong business case for nature. Yes, RADA, everyone's a bit nervous and people are getting quiet, but people, businesses, corporates that we speak to are also telling us that they know now that there is a business risk, and they are therefore thinking about that, even if perhaps they might be a little quieter on it for the time being. We also know that different industries are thinking about this differently. I mean, we're coming off the back of, a cyclone, and you hate to point to disruptions for making change, but sometimes these are also important. The insurance industry is in the spotlight again. The Insurance Association last year, the year before, came out with their Nature Positive report, and they pointed directly to investing in wetlands and water systems to reduce the impact of climate change and natural disasters, and they pointed directly to a nature market as being a potential opportunity for their investments to mitigate against the costs. Cost of living crisis isn't necessarily at this point directly connected to the loss of nature, but it is becoming so, and people are realising that their insurance premiums increasing, their increasing food costs at the supermarket are increasing because we are seeing declining environmental conditions. So those things will come together and will start to become, political influences.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we talk about this a lot at the Nature Finance Council, but nature and protecting and restoring nature has to be viewed as a multi-year, long-term, nation-building play. That this is a critical infrastructure of our society, here and abroad. And it's not the work of one government, it's the work of successive governments. But it has to be not a nice to have, but critical to resilience, and critical for people to live productively and happily and safely and securely. So completely, agree with the points that Jody's raised.
I'm reluctant to answer that one. This isn't working, but that's probably trying to silence me.
It is.
I mean, just talking personally, I have obviously both sides of government have continued to disappoint us now over many years. I've come and gone from Australia over the last kind of 15, 20 years, and it's always tabled as an election issue of minor importance. We have environment is seen as a department that's a junior ministry. We have a minister that tabled a nature positive agenda and called a global nature positive summit, as I'm hearing this and I'm sharing it here, was a strategy to move into a more prominent and senior ministry. So what could be achieved out of this agenda to enable movement into something which was seen as more important than the environment. And the fact that government and voters are voting for this, that this is seen as being important, but not the bigger issues around things like cost of living and health size of the economy, means that we obviously need to play that game. And that game is not using our votes to influence change. It's obviously where we put our investments. It's where we put our superannuation. The assets under management by Australian super funds is significant and is contributing to, however you define nature positive, certainly contributing to fundamentally nature negative business practices. And so I respect the question, but my response is that government will just continue to disappoint us. And so that's not where the change is going to come from.
Fair enough. Thank you, Guy. So any questions from the floor? I think Andres is going to find a mic. Yep. And Josh.
Thanks very much. Great panel. Slightly polemical question. Do you think recent criticism of carbon markets has made it easier for companies to walk away from their targets and made it easier for governments to water down their commitments? And if so, what are your thoughts on how we get more constructive criticism so that we can move forward?
I think, or I don't think, I know that, well, let's put it that way. There is undoubtedly, there undoubtedly have been actual bad actors and fraud in carbon markets, as there are in all industries. And I'm grateful and thankful that those individuals and those companies here and abroad are being ferreted out. There's no place for it. Secondly, absolutely, there is improvement that can be made in methods. As we learn more, as we get experience, those things shift. And certain things that were additional or what have you in the past, they're no longer in the future or today, like renewable energy, for example, in certain parts of the world. But the outrage-based media and outrage-based gotcha kind of stories have been hugely damaging. There is millions of dollars of carbon contracts and investment that have been pulled from the table. I have seen it even in pension funds and institutional investors not wanting to invest in something like the California carbon market, which is a classic cap and trade system. Absolutely, emissions are going down because they just don't want to be involved in this tiny little part, even though it can actually generate greater returns for them by managing forests for timber and sustainable timber and carbon. I've seen it in that. I've seen it in the voluntary market. I have recently had a conversation with a carbon buyer who's very active, and they said, "Oh, look, we're looking at that project, and there's this one issue, and it's just we think the project's amazing, but that one issue, it's a little bit complex to explain, and we just don't want to get involved in any outrage-based articles, even though they would be completely unbased. So yeah, we're not going to move forward on that project." And that is happening all over the world. So I think we do have to be very cognizant of that, and it's a bigger symptom of what's happening in our society. But absolutely, for some companies, it's like, okay, well, now I can just kind of it's all garbage anyway, so I can walk away. And that's where, to Jody's point, like coming back to climate risk and the importance of this in terms of the business case becomes really, really important at the board level to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Also, another perverse outcome has been efforts and initiatives to try and imagine and develop a nature market, whether it's around biodiversity credit initiatives, have distanced themselves from the lessons that we can learn from both successes and failures from carbon markets, and recognising that this presents a really important platform with a fungible unit and something which does, in many markets, kind of work to act as that entry point. And in our conversations around, we've talked about integrity principles for nature markets and biodiversity markets in particular, have started from scratch. And I've been in rooms where they said, blank piece of paper, anybody got any suggestions for how we develop these principles? And we have so many lessons to learn, but not just the bad failings, as you said, also from the successes to build on, which is really important.
Thanks, Guy. The question.
Thank you. I'll try to be as succinct as I can, but it looks like there are a bunch of challenges that you're facing and we're facing in this. But I guess as someone who has worked like on the operational level in conservation, how do we ensure that the credits, and I guess you talked a bit about it with competition, but ensuring that there's long-term sustainability for these projects, especially with First Nation groups as well, so that it's not just an offset or a credit that can be purchased discretionally, but actually follows through into long-term, I guess, rehabilitation or whatever it is for those environmental projects.
I think there's a couple of ways. Again, it goes to the design and the methodology. So one of the things is the term of the contract, and there's a range of thoughts and perspectives, but 25-year terms, and we've been suggesting and again pushing for a protection method. But at the moment, the way the nature repair market is set up is that they can be either 25 years or 100-year terms. So obviously, a 100-year term, gives certainty and security for the project. I think the other thing is thinking about as we're innovating and designing projects and testing things and learning, we need people coming to the table who are helping to de-risk some of these projects and ideas for, early stage developers. And I think that's where we need to see, a combination of blended finance approaches, different investment tools to invest in the development of programs that are going to last, because enduring outcomes, we know in the conservation space that biodiversity is both complex and also takes time, and that can be said the same for building community and human resilience as well, and ensuring that the funds go to the communities who are delivering the outcomes. So I think the design is going to be really important for that.
There are things that, again, trying to think about the US example, in the mitigation banking world, a percentage of credit sales, it's defined from the beginning, have to go to an endowed trust. There's a 100-year or permanent conservation easement on the land, so it can't go back to being a soybean field. And then oftentimes those pieces of land are then at the end of the project, once all credits are all sold, it's ceded to a land trust with an endowment. So there's instruments that can be used. But when I was at New Forest, we were doing some really amazing, projects with old growth forests in Alaska. And so as part of the project, we were getting the young people in the local tribal corporation trained up to do monitoring, reporting, verification. So really in building those skills into the local community, so that ultimately that stewardship can live on in a very practical way.
Guy, anything we got?
Yeah, just a quick one, I suppose, as well, is we've seen obviously some really scary precedent in terms of, shifting in terms of both government and legislation, and how if we put, once again, a lot of focus on the permanence of these projects and the security of these projects being linked to government and legislation, it can put us in a pickle. Communities across, particularly Southeast Asia, where I've done a lot of work, who have been working on some of these initiatives for 20 years. In the last couple of weeks, they've had total funding and certainty pulled out of their projects through development finance. And so that's, real projects that are they're not immature projects, they're mature, they have livelihoods deeply connected. And they were before these projects, but the fickleness of finance in terms of, what's the flavour at the moment, and then it's no longer driving decisions, and so it leaves a landscape. And also the fickleness of government as well is something that we need to try and shift. And I suppose that's through obviously making sure there are really strong incentives and really strong, range of benefits that are being provided at a local community, that they can also access markets and bring various different initiatives through to market. But that's, I think in terms of that point around permanence and security, we're seeing some challenges to that at the moment, which are a bit of a worry.
Very good. Thanks, Guy. Roger?
Thanks to the panel for an interesting discussion. But a lot of what you've been talking about is focused on projects and trying to develop the instruments, the nature instruments. And you sort of touched on the demand side by saying how policy can influence, price or what goes into the system. Shouldn't you be focusing the other way and creating the demand by making the policy push the money into nature repair, without thinking about how many credits do I need to buy? Because once you have money going into the system, and the people who, whether it's a percentage of revenue or cost for a project or whatever the measure is, once you have that money going into the system, those who are putting it in are going to look for the best quality rather than the lowest cost or the, whatever's easiest to buy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ample room to debate things like, National Natural Infrastructure Fund, or a percentage of all contributions going into super is going into environmental conservation and restoration, We could be thinking about nature in terms of macroeconomic stability and, where do we need capital diverted into? So there's a lot of ways I think that, there's a lot of ideas around how to get bigger pools of capital into nature conservation and restoration linked to economic activity. So we can try and flip the narrative on its head. I hope that's what I'm addressing what you're thinking about. But those are some. I mean, to me, those are the big ideas. Those are the game changers, in fact, to actually think about kind of turning all of this on its head. Of course, then there's another layer of detail about how would you actually spend that money effectively and efficiently, which is a whole other quagmire, I think. But the big idea of like turning the narrative on its head, or the flow of dollars on its head, is really that's the big picture, I think.
Yeah, I think that sort of gets there. What I was thinking more was any nature negative, X% of any nature negative activity has to get spent on repair.
Yeah,
Because then there's an
100%,
incentive to lower,
100%. We can
less
define that
nature.
in lots of different ways. And as Jody said, the very first step of that is getting rid of the subsidies that are creating harm. I mean, that's the first step, right? Much less than getting to the, kind of a tax for nature kind of thing.
Great panel. Thank you, everyone. Larissa Taylor from Perth. A question for the panel. How can we bring productivity into our policy formation work on nature? And I'm particularly thinking around the productivity pressures in food, water, agri-food supply chains. Thanks.
Interesting question.
Guy's not putting his hand up. So I think there's some really great innovations and programs that are exploring that very idea, Larissa. And, some of those go to programs like Farming for the Future and others that are starting to... I think one of the challenges with, going back to a point I made earlier around landholder confusion, all these options on the table, we need to make sure that these are viable options for farming and productive communities. We need to ensure that, there's different motivations for farming communities participating in a market like this. And one is going to be that their productive farm is less productive and they're looking to diversify their income streams and use parts of that farm for other land use activities. The other element of that is that they are starting to realise and value the role of healthy land condition in improving their productivity. And that's where I was going to. There's some really great programs that are starting to better demonstrate that relationship between the healthy functioning ecosystems, soils, water flows, etc., that is improving a land condition, because we are, across the world seeing continuing land degradation, and that's impacting on food security and productivity. So to be able to create links and connections between investments in natural capital and then to have that demonstrate a return on productivity and profitability are going to be the game changers for landholder participation from a natural capital perspective.
It's a really good question, Larissa, and I think Jody was talking before in terms of the resilience of natural ecosystems, both from a climate perspective, but also from a from a broader native system perspective. And Rada gave some examples in terms of what a natural forest versus a modified forest in terms of its value. So building that kind of resilience, therefore productivity, and recognising that these are healthy living landscapes that deliver a whole range of values to a range of different stakeholders, I think is really important, as opposed to it being a clear set-aside. Set-asides have a role to play, but also seeing these things as being kind of quite integrated mosaic landscapes that are delivering resilience and productivity, I think is a really good way of looking at it.
Productivity is, it's an interesting point to make, and it speaks to the value of nature and ecosystem services, and also the role of nature as blue-green infrastructure and creating resilience to climate risks, which of course then draws into mind different types of nature finance mechanisms. Okay, there's a question.
Sorry, I don't know about anyone else, but my head feels like it's going to explode. I need a drink. Talked a lot about the demand side coming from government and business, but what about the role of the consumer? Is there a role for the consumer in nature markets?
So much, such a big role. I mean, you're sitting next to Josh Bishop, and a lot of the work that Josh led with the Transforming Markets initiative through WWF and looking at very much kind of consumer-facing products and initiatives around sustainable agricultural landscapes and oil palm and sugar and beef and those types of things. Once again, this is a group of new friends, so it's a safe space. We put a lot of hope in those initiatives, but consumers are obviously, like business people, have a bandwidth, but they're also being confronted with a whole range of different issues and challenges, cost of living being front of that, but also through digital media and new media is just fashion. Like their attention to making choices changes very quickly based on the media and information that they're receiving. And so we held out, we being many of us, including Josh and I, that the consumers could drive real change, and they can. They play a really important market to make really smart choices, to influence not just through the products that they purchase at Woolworths and Coles, but also through purchasing and investing in making choices around super, for example, or the banks that they decide to bank with. So huge amount of hope and potential, but over the last, I'm going to say 5 to 10 years, it seemed like it's dropped off. And that's because there's other real issues which are confronting everyday mums and dad consumers, and that's really important. But yeah.
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 Yeah, I mean, Asha, you've spent all your time at Woolies. You probably can give us a lecture on that, on this question. But I think there's sort of two things. I mean, one, I've even gotten to the point, as someone who's thinking all the time about what I'm consuming, I just don't trust anything anymore. I don't trust what anybody's saying, like people just throw words around and they're kind of meaningless. So I think there is a very important part of trusting, but in some ways you could get rid of all of that if the businesses themselves are just integrating, better practices into what they're producing. So I think that's one element of getting consumers kind of re-engaged is believing kind of what's being said. And that's one of the reasons I'm on the board of Accounting for Nature, is because it's trying to create a very transparent, rigorous, science-backed way of making claims about nature condition attached to landscapes and products. But I think also there's a big values discussion to be had here. Like 40, 50 years of hyper-capitalism has created a lot of instability and some very strange things that are going on in our world. And I actually think there is a bit of a global awakening happening around that, and, not less around kind of social media and communications and all of that. And so I think there's this is maybe a more philosophical, existential question, but I think that's a really important one. What is it that we actually value as societies, and how do we then use that to influence who we vote for, the choices that we make, who we work for, what do we study, what companies do we engage with, where do we invest, all of those things.
Interesting reflections. Thank you, Radha. I think, and it came up earlier this morning, that mindset and values is a very important part of how we actually improve this picture going forward. Yeah. Are there any other questions from the Blonit?
Great. Hi, all. Thank you for the panel. My question is relating to the rating agencies. So we saw, I think, in January, the downgrading of the LA Power and Water municipal bonds. How can we use the rating agencies as levers for change in this regard and help them to be better educated about the risks that the loss of nature poses, both on, obviously, debt instruments and to the corporates themselves, because we know that the corporates, the thing they fear most is their cost of debt going up and their cost of equity going up, and the rating agency has greatest power in that regard.
I mean, I don't know if I'm fully qualified. I don't think I'm qualified, actually. I know I'm not qualified to answer your very thoughtful question. But, there are analysts, right? Behind those rating agencies are analysts who fully understand, industries and what reading a balance sheet, reading a P&L, having a sense of, what's going to drive the ability of a company to pay back, interest or, pay back on debt instruments. I just wonder if there's just a whole other piece of training and learning and understanding that has to come from, oh, what does climate change or, collapse of an ecosystem or inability to access a particular ingredient, what does that mean for this company? So take a very practical example, and I'm going to talk about Sally over at Blackmores, who some of you may know in the room, and they have hundreds of ingredients in making their supplements. And so they've gone through each one and taken a lens around the risk of being able to access those ingredients, and from like Peruvian anchovies to, I don't know, like all sorts of different things. And if you listen to Sally talk about it, that's actually changed business practice. So if you were an analyst looking at Blackmores and comparing that to another, and they're very clear about how they've done that, and you compare that to other nutritional supply companies that haven't done that work, you'd go, well, maybe Blackmores is a less risky company. So, and that's the kind of work that needs to be done across sectors and businesses.
So better investor conversations about nature, risk, and their value chains and whether or not they've accounted for it, which TNFD is meant to get to, of course. Yeah. Any other questions? We do?
Yay. Yay.
You were talking about wetlands and their power in mitigating against flood and drought. It's about that. My project for this week was to launch Cool the Country. Cool the Country. Go to YouTube, series of videos, fun and packed full of impactful stories that tie into everything you're talking about. Large-scale projects that we can invest in. On the back of this week, I think I have a project to take to government that's a cost of living argument for wetland regeneration in the Warragamba Dam catchment, which is where the first settlers went over the hills, found the wetlands, said, that looks like lovely green country, I'll cut a drainage line through it, dry it out and farm it, and 200 years later, those are the huge erosion gullies. There's proof of concept in the videos, check it out, it's fantastic, where erosion gullies have been turned into chains of ponds. We do that across Warragamba, and instead of, and this is where the cost of living comes in, instead of Sydney Water going ahead with wastewater regeneration plants, at the moment they're proposing spending tens of billions over the next 10 years.
Is there a question in there?
Yes, the question is, can I recruit you all, and what advice have you got for delivering a message to government?
Well, maybe that's something that you could speak to panel members or audience members offline. But I don't, Okay. So something they might kind of take on notice, perhaps.
Congratulations, and look forward to having a look at it.
Josh, any other panelists from before?
All right. Is there, we're in our last 5 or 10 minutes. Is there another question? Okay. Andres, is there? Yep. I see 2.
All right. Actually, I guess off the back, a question around land tenure and ownership in relation to, I guess, nature repair markets and things. And yeah, there are millions of hectares of protected areas, and a question directly around, its own Crown, government-owned or managed. What's your perspectives on the nature repair market legislation and the relationship with those protected areas, government managed, and what are the opportunities there potentially? Maybe some international examples as well could be useful.
It is part of the objects of the Nature Repair Act to deliver on the targets, which includes a protection target. So ideally, the nature repair market would be able to, in the future, have certificates that do allow investments into protection. And when you think about organisations who might invest in a market, one of the things that we would expect to see, so the Science Based Targets Network talks about, some of the measures and indicators and drivers of investment, and organisations needing to have delivered on their mitigation hierarchy before investing. And part of that is avoided impact. So they've identified their risks and they've identified their impacts. And those impacts, one of the mitigation hierarchy elements is avoided risk. So how can a company think about avoiding risk? They can protect before it's too late, so before it's destroyed. So investments in protection, there's a pathway for that through the Science Based Targets Network. The Nature Repair Market Act should be driving investments into protection, either as a positive contribution to a nature positive world. So a protection method is a priority method, and it could look like a number of things. Absolutely, it could look like a government, a public protected area. It could look like an Indigenous protected area. It could look like an individual landholder choosing to have a conservation covenant, or the acquisition of land by a private organisation for the purpose of biodiversity. So the method isn't developed yet. We don't know what the method is going to look like yet, but it should be a method in the future that will drive investments into protection.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I thank you so much for that question, because I think conservation is so important. And, I would look around internationally and say, in fact, these kinds of environmental markets have effectively failed conservation. In the international realm, there was, this real view that, carbon markets were going to be what saved tropical forests. And in fact, now there's just so much scrutiny about, well, what would the deforestation rate have looked like over the next 20 years? And, and in the meantime, we're just losing forests, just football pitch by football pitch on a daily basis. And so, in fact, we've got to kind of, again, flip the whole thing on its head and say that actually avoided loss is incredibly important, and that's actually one of the most valuable things that we can do to mitigate climate change, or protect ourselves from a nature basis. And so, and even things like the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is on the voluntary carbon market side. I don't want to get into all of that, but it's even sort of said, oh well, we don't really want you to buy credits from conserving forests because it's too risky. So we want just you to focus on restoration or removals. But that to me makes absolutely no sense when you think about what we're actually trying to achieve holistically. So we've got to focus on conservation.
Just another quick reflection as well. There's also the other side of it, which is that protected areas are, in some cases, very well managed and very effective. In other cases, they're actually under threat from a whole range of external issues. As a resident of the Blue Mountains, we have a wonderful World Heritage Area where there's all sorts of ongoing threats around it. And in designing good projects adjacent to protected areas, there's issues around leakage and cumulative impact that are really important. In some places outside of Australia, and not wanting to paint a dark story, but it is also an opportunity, is we have paper parks and we have areas that have been set aside through covenants where there is a whole range of competing impacts and threats to them. I've worked a fair bit in Papua New Guinea, our northern neighbours, and in the Gulf province there's a relatively new 5-year-old large-scale landscape protected area that has 5 competing concessions. One of those is protection, because it still hasn't been passed through or tabled through government. It also has logging and timber, it has rubber, it has oil palm, and it also has coal. So you have these areas that have been success stories of conservation in terms of the covenanting of land for new protected areas for avoided loss that are still under threat. And so finance is needed to be able to improve and secure those. And I think nature markets plays a really important role in terms of feeding into that component.
We've got time for one more question, and then I'd like to wrap up.
All right, so let's talk, especially acknowledging today's sponsor. Talk about surprising markets, governments that have got it right. I've seen some interesting things coming out of Colombia, for example. What inspires you?
Yeah, I mean, it's worthwhile throwing to Andre. I think Trioma is a fantastic story. You know, we're really lucky to have Andre living in Sydney, but he represents an organisation which, once again, this is putting aside around the broader picture around big finance and big scale of projects, but in terms of engaging with businesses, priority businesses, and engaging with customers through that as well. We've talked about this today. In Colombia, there are those kind of success stories. So maybe, I don't know, throwing to Andre just to talk about that work around consumers and businesses that are engaging in your program.
Yeah, so we're finding that there's a willingness. So countries like Colombia, I think similar to what Jody was saying, we're very proud of our natural resources. We value them deeply. And anyone that you can have a conversation with around that, they're going to agree with the changes we need to make. So businesses try to work, the ones that we engage with, they try to work to have a positive impact and try to link directly the impact from the consumer into what we're doing. And that's the bridge that we have to cross, and that's what we have to try to do. But there is willingness, and there's a massive SME market that wants to tap into this, that wants to take part, but none of the solutions at the moment are necessarily addressing them. It's just simply looking at big corporate. And so I think that there's an opportunity to bring in people, community, but then also to bring in that SME market that makes up 90% of the businesses around the world, and then just allow them to take part into what we're trying to do all here and what all these conversations are about.
And not blowing too much hair up Trioma, but I think what they've also done in terms of technologies, we had a panel earlier today like this, waiting for new shiny technologies. You know, nature provides us with so many wonderful solutions. If you sit and observe and listen, and you listen to those people who have been connected to country for a long time, the technologies come from nature. And the amazing solution that Trioma is bringing is just letting nature and forest regenerate using natural behaviour and practices. It's nothing, there's not some amazing IP technology that's hidden within it, patent pending. It's you know, it's nature, it's open source, and it's providing some really good solutions.
And
Guy.
I was just going to say, where you're seeing the money go to the ground and to local communities, I think is really important, and we need to hear more and more stories about that. And while the two examples that I'll bring largely rely on the carbon markets, I think we need to think about why and how those have worked. So one example is the Savannah Burning program in Australia, so local to home. It's delivered through a carbon market, but the carbon and you know, the communities up there will talk, you know, have more right to talk about this, but the carbon outcome is sort of third on the chain of outcomes that they're trying to achieve, and really using the carbon market to drive outcomes for community, to drive outcomes for culture, to drive outcomes for economic benefits for Aboriginal communities that are delivering those. And the nature, the biodiversity outcomes of the Savannah Burning projects are also co-benefits. So we have, you know, in our own country, some really fantastic examples. They've been designed for the purpose of you know, what's needed for the communities living out there. And they are generating and you know, the carbon credits. I think the other example that's worth pointing to, again closer to home, is the Koala Friendly Carbon Initiative. And the reason I'd raise that is because sometimes it doesn't just take a single mechanism or market. It takes a combined group of people and blended finance and different investors to actually innovate and make something work. So this is the creation of a high integrity, again, carbon credit. It's certified by Accounting for Nature. It's assured by WWF, and its plan is to regenerate more than 10,000 hectares of high abundance koala habitat by 2034. It's focused on the koala habitat, but it's also focused on connectivity across the areas, and it's also focused on ecosystem condition. It's ensuring permanence, and it's also established a fund a revolving planting fund. So there's lots of different elements that often come together around these kinds of programs as we're innovating and designing things that can work for nature and people.
These are all really great, hopeful stories on which to bring the event to a close. And on that note, if I could ask the panel one more thing. This is Climate Action Week, after all. There have been some hints along the way, but what would you say to everybody in the audience in our different roles and responsibilities, whether it's in work or at home? What can we each do as a takeaway to support Nature Positive, to actually get some further momentum building in this space? What would you say?
Number one, I mean, you have to do it anyways here, but it would resonate with more with an American crowd, but vote. Have your voice heard at all levels of government. It's the most powerful tool and instrument that we've got. And secondly, remain hopeful and optimistic, and there's lots of really good things to be done.
I think, we are here for Climate Week, and I think one of the things that I often get despondent about is, nature not being recognised as a critical solution to our climate challenges. So I guess I'd just encourage us all to think about nature in the context of the things we're doing for climate on a daily basis, getting out in nature. And I think one of the things we were talking about before is just people's connection to our natural environment and how that is decreasing. So getting out in nature is really important for all of us. I can say that having just done it over the weekend, and I feel so good. Oh no, I won't steal yours because I reckon you're going to say it. Put your money where your mouth is. Goes back to the consumer power. Yeah.
That was what I was going to say.
Told you.
Now, I think there was a call from an earlier panel today. I think it was from Camille from Xylo around the need to have conversations and to have open conversations and to create those safe spaces, ideally in nature, where people who are still kind of working out what this means for them, for their decisions as a consumer or as a voter, and where you can have those. That this is an ongoing and an open conversation. I think we've had a great start to that today and this week. But I think obviously actively debating and discussing these issues and collaborating on solutions is really important. So have the chat.
Great, thank you. Thanks to each and every one of our panelist members. Really appreciate you giving the time to this. Thanks to all of you for coming and for the thoughtful questions that have come up to the panel. So, better get that drink, Asha.